What actually happened to the people who went down with the Titanic? And is it true that the entire tragedy was predicted 14 years before it even happened? Who was the person who knew about the icebergs but deliberately kept it a secret? In just a few moments, we're going to dive into all of this and so much more. So, if you've already subscribed and hit that notification bell, let's get right into it. The mind-blowing mysteries of the Titanic. Back then, she was the largest ship to ever sail the seas, and easily the most luxurious. Her officers and crew were the absolute best of the Royal Navy, and the passenger cabins put the finest five-star hotels of the era to shame. She was called the biggest, most luxurious, and totally unsinkable ship in history. Even if 9 of her compartments flooded, the ship would still stay afloat. This basically made her virtually unsinkable. Now, if this story sounds familiar, just wait, because these exact words are actually the opening lines of a novel written 14 years before the Titanic disaster. It's from Morgan Robertson's 1898 novella, The Wreck of the Titan, also known as Futility. The book tells the story of a luxury ocean liner named the Titan that hits an iceberg and sinks in the North Atlantic. And contrary to what you might think, this isn't some urban legend or internet hoax. This book actually exists, and an original copy is kept in the Harvard Library. We already mentioned the ship was named the Titan, but here is where things get genuinely creepy. On page 4 it says, though it was April, the salt air was chill. As we know, the Titanic also sank in April, and the weather was indeed freezing. Then, on page 26, a cry echoes from the crow's nest. Ice ahead! Right there, dead ahead. The ship strikes the iceberg on her starboard side. The iceberg slices open the Titan's hull like a razor blade. If the impact had been head-on, the passengers wouldn't have suffered much more than a good jolt, and the ship would have survived. Guess what? The Titanic also hit the iceberg on her starboard side. Her hull was sliced open like a razor, and that's exactly how she went down. On top of all that, the book mentions the ship was crossing the Atlantic, and one of its stops was New York Harbor. Of course, there are plenty of differences between the two stories, but the fact that both disasters happened in a freezing April in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, with almost identical ship names and the exact same crash scenario, it's terrifyingly similar. To this day, nobody can really explain this crazy coincidence. The headlines back then screamed, over 1,200 missing. On April 17th, a steamer out of Halifax set sail and reached the crash site. They launched a massive search and rescue operation across a huge area. They stayed out there until April 26th and managed to recover 306 bodies from the ocean surface. In total, 1,514 people lost their lives, meaning more than 1,200 were still missing. Most of them had clearly been dragged down into the deep ocean. Just put yourself in the shoes of those families for a second. You lose a loved one or a close relative in this horrific crash, but you have no idea where their body is. You can't even give them a proper funeral. That's why the families wanted them found, no matter what. But bringing the bodies back to their families was pretty much impossible because they were nearly 4,000. Most of them had clearly been dragged down into the deep ocean. Just put yourself in the shoes of those families for a second. You lose a loved one or a close relative in this horrific crash, but you have no idea where their body is. You can't even give them a proper funeral. That's why the families wanted them found, no matter what. But bringing the bodies back to their families was pretty much impossible because they were nearly 4,000 meters under the sea. Still, people started brainstorming. They thought about using underwater photography technology to scout the ocean floor and find a way to bring the bodies up. For example, footage from a 1916 film is actually one of the first ever underwater videos. This underwater recording, which lasted only 9 minutes, is basically the grandfather of modern underwater documentaries. Anyway, the whole goal was to look at the wreckage just like that. Of course, looking back now, that was a bit optimistic for the time. Eventually, people started coming up with some really wild, utopian ideas just to get a glimpse of the deep sea. They talked about building a massive ladder system, or another setup where you'd go underwater with a giant light to help take photos. The Williamson brothers even thought of a telescopic system that could go deep into the ocean. People even wondered if they could pull the Titanic all the way up to the surface. Obviously, all of these attempts failed. Years later, in August 1934, a team designed an underwater camera system to shoot a movie called 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Using this cast iron system, they managed to dive 928 meters below the surface. But that wasn't even close to where the Titanic was resting. By this point, the families had completely lost all hope. Still, the big question remained. Were the victims' remains still down there? By the 1980s, technology had advanced, and people started trying new methods. The wreck of the Titanic still hadn't been found. By looking at the last known coordinates sent from the ship, they managed to narrow down the search area significantly. They scanned about 80% of this area, but it ended in total disappointment. Nothing. Another team wanted to scan the tiny remaining section. Just when they were about to give up all hope, they finally found the wreck. But during the search, instead of human skeletons, they only found clothes and shoes. There was absolutely no trace of the bodies themselves. The truth is, the bodies had turned to dust within just 10 years. Because at a depth of 4,000 meters, there is very little calcium carbonate, meaning human bones dissolve in a very short time. After the Titanic sank, an official investigation was launched, and people wanted answers. For instance, one of the biggest question marks was why the ship didn't slow down after receiving multiple iceberg warnings. Before hitting the iceberg, the ship was pushing almost maximum speed. Lord Mersey, who led the investigation, took extensive notes, and in one of them, he wrote, "No reduction of speed after warnings." Despite the iceberg alerts, the Titanic was going full throttle. Later on, the blame for this was heavily pinned on J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line. He was actually on board the Titanic during that voyage. The reason the iceberg warning I mentioned in the first video probably never reached the captain was likely because of Ismay. Ismay was looking out for the company's reputation and didn't want the ship to slow down. Why? Because their rival company Cunard already had incredibly fast ships. If the Titanic slowed down during its maiden voyage, it could lose its appeal just because of the travel time. He chose arriving on time over arriving safely. Looking at the notes and records, this theory seems highly realistic. If those warnings had been taken seriously, and the captain had slowed down, the Titanic would have been moving much slower. It would have maneuvered easily, and the disaster probably would have never happened. As people look deeper into the Titanic, it becomes clear that this was no ordinary accident. And honestly, it's pretty clear what kind of massive negligence we are talking about here. One of the biggest blunders was definitely the lifeboats. When the Titanic was being designed, the position and number of lifeboats were actually well planned. The ship was originally supposed to carry 48 lifeboats, but Bruce Ismay thought they looked too cluttered and ruined the ship's luxury aesthetic, so he cut that number down to the absolute bare minimum allowed by law. Now, here is the crazy part. According to a maritime regulation from 1894, the number of lifeboats a ship had to carry wasn't based on the passenger capacity. It was based entirely on the ship's weight and volume. So by those outdated rules, the Titanic legally only needed 16 lifeboats. There was no law stopping shipping companies from carrying enough lifeboats for everyone on board. But companies just stuck to the bare minimum because it saved money and left more open space on the decks. In the end, the Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats in total, 16 wooden ones and 4 collapsible ones. That was only enough for 1,178 passengers. To make matters worse, they made another massive mistake. They didn't even fill the lifeboats to full capacity. Many boats were launched with dozens of empty seats. If those lifeboats had been completely filled, 468 more lives would have been saved. And guess who managed to hop onto one of those limited lifeboats and survive the disaster he helped cause? Yep, Bruce Ismay himself. Let me tell you something else that will give you chills. That book I mentioned earlier, the one written 14 years before the disaster, says this on page to the unsinkable ship, Titan. carried as few boats as would satisfy the laws. It's honestly terrifying how even this specific detail perfectly matches what happened to the Titanic. Bruce Ismay cut down the lifeboats and pushed the ship to go full speed, directly causing it to hit the iceberg and leading to this absolute tragedy. Amazingly, Ismay was cleared of all charges by the court. But 25 years later, after going blind and suffering from a severe stroke, he passed away. According to the official 1912 accident report, the iceberg supposedly ripped a massive 91-meter gash along the right side of the hull. In their eyes, the iceberg tore the ship wide open, and that was the only reason it sank. But according to the eyewitnesses, the actual survivors, it took about 2.5 hours for the ship to go under. A 91-meter gash would have sunk the Titanic in less than 30 minutes. Recently, experts looked at ultra-high resolution images of the Titanic created by stitching together thousands of photos, and they noticed something incredible. The actual area where the iceberg sliced. The hull was shockingly small, only about 8 to 9 meters long. Ocean water rushed into the ship through this smaller leak, but it happened much slower than a massive rip would have. And that finally explains how the ship took 2.5 long hours to sink. Back in 2003, James Cameron, the director of the movie Titanic, did something that had never been done before. He managed to film parts of the Titanic that no human eye had seen since 1912. Take a look at this. This is the crow's nest, the lookout tower where the iceberg was spotted for the very first time. The iceberg that sank the Titanic was seen right from here. And over here are the grand, majestic stairs, the exact spot where Jack and Rose reunited at the end of the movie. Today, absolutely nothing is left of that grandeur. This is the dining saloon where first-class, wealthy passengers used to eat and chat. The window still looks surprisingly clear, almost like it did that night. Here are the plates where they ate their very last meal. And these are the boilers. The crew members used to work right here, at the absolute bottom of the ship. They were the very first to die, but what's left outside the ship is just as heartbreaking as what's inside. Look at this shoe with its laces still tightly tied. Whoever passed away was wearing these shoes at that exact moment. Just think about it. Down at the bottom of the ocean, your body is eaten by sea creatures. Your skeleton quickly dissolves into nothing, and the only thing left of you is your shoes. The Titanic isn't just some random shipwreck story you can just read and move on from. It's a massive web of mysteries, horrifying moments, and deeply tragic stories. Just look at the shoes of this 19-month-old baby. He was just one of the many babies who drowned in those final, terrifying moments, and today, this shoe is the only piece of him left. They said not even God could sink the Titanic, but she sank anyway. It was an absolute nightmare and a tragedy for those thousands of people. But hey, for the live lobsters waiting in the kitchen to be cooked, it was an absolute miracle. And sometimes miracles happen when you least expect them.